Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Stockholm National Museum heist of 2000. Picture the city of Stockholm as it appeared on the late afternoon of Friday, December 22nd, in the year 2000. The winter solstice had only just passed, leaving the Swedish capital submerged in a deep, sapphire-blue twilight that felt as though it might never truly end. The air was a sharp, crystalline presence, biting gently at the skin of anyone brave enough to linger on the cobblestone streets. Down by the water, the Baltic Sea breathed a heavy, salt-laden mist that clung to the grand facades of the old buildings, turning every street lamp into a fuzzy, golden orb. It was the kind of evening where the world feels small and intimate, wrapped in the heavy, comforting wool of winter and the quiet anticipation of the coming holidays. The city was alive with the soft hum of shoppers moving through the markets, their heavy boots crunching rhythmically against the thin, powdery layer of snow that dusted the earth like powdered sugar. Above, the stars were hidden by a thick, velvety blanket of clouds, holding in the scent of wood smoke and the faint, sweet aroma of toasted almonds and mulled wine from the nearby stalls. You can almost feel the chill on your cheeks and the warmth of a heavy scarf as we walk through this frozen, festive landscape. The National Museum stood like a silent sentinel on the edge of the Blasieholm Peninsula, its massive, Renaissance-style architecture casting long, imposing shadows over the dark, churning waters of the harbor. Inside, the atmosphere was one of profound, hushed reverence, a sanctuary of stone and pigment. The high, vaulted ceilings and polished marble floors amplified every small sound. The soft, distant click of a visitor's heel, the gentle rustle of a heavy winter coat being adjusted, the rhythmic, metallic ticking of a grand clock that seemed to mark the passing of centuries rather than mere minutes. In the long galleries, the air was perfectly still and cool, meticulously preserved to protect the treasures that lived within those walls. Priceless canvases by the masters of light and shadow hung in the silence, their colors muted by the dim evening lighting that sought to prevent any glare. There was a sense of absolute permanence here, a feeling that these thick stone walls were impenetrable, and that the history they held was safe from the chaotic, fast-moving world outside. Security guards, dressed in their dark, crisp uniforms, paced the corridors with a slow, practiced gait, their eyes scanning the familiar gold-leaf frames of works by Rembrandt and Renoir. It was nearing 5 o'clock in the evening, and the museum was slowly preparing to close its heavy wooden doors, signaling the end of another quiet day dedicated to the pursuit of beauty. But miles away, at the Hotel Sheraton, the peace was about to be shattered in a way that would paralyze the city's defenses and leave the authorities grasping at shadows. A car sat parked in the cold, its engine silent and cold, its presence entirely unremarkable amidst the sea of holiday traffic and the rushing pedestrians. Then, at precisely 4:45, the silence of the neighborhood was torn apart by a sudden, violent roar that seemed to split the very sky. A bomb, hidden deep within the vehicle, detonated with a force that rattled the windows of every building for blocks, sending a shower of glass dancing across the pavement like diamonds. The sound was a physical weight, a deep, resonant thud that vibrated in the chests of those nearby and echoed off the granite walls of the surrounding streets. Suddenly, the evening air was filled with the acrid, biting smell of burning rubber and scorched metal. Thick, oily black smoke began to curl upward, obscuring the festive holiday lights and the gray, winter sky. People froze in their tracks, their faces momentarily illuminated by the flickering orange glow of the growing fire. Panic, cold and sharp as an ice shard, began to ripple through the crowds. This was the first move in a carefully choreographed dance of chaos, a distraction designed to draw every available police officer, every wailing siren, and every ounce of official attention toward the smoke and away from the quiet museum by the water. As the first sirens began to wail in the distance, A second explosion tore through the quiet air near the Hallwell Museum, not far from the bridge leading to the National Museum itself. This was not a random act of senseless violence, but a calculated tactical strike of terrifying precision. The robbers had anticipated every move the Stockholm police would make, and they were ready to turn the city's own narrow streets against them. Along the main arterial roads that led toward the Blasieholm Peninsula, the thieves had scattered hundreds of sharp, multi-pointed steel nails across the dark asphalt. In the deepening darkness, these tiny spikes were invisible, lying in wait like a hidden trap. As the squad cars raced toward the scenes of the explosions, their blue lights flashing against the snow, their tires were shredded by the cold metal. The sound of hissing air and the grinding of metal rims against the pavement added a new, discordant layer to the cacophony of the city. The police force, usually so efficient and swift in their response, found itself physically hobbled, unable to move through the very labyrinth they were sworn to protect. The gridlock was absolute, a frozen knot of metal, rubber, and confusion that left the National Museum isolated and vulnerable in the middle of the dark harbor, its protectors blocked by a sea of flat tires and smoke. The distraction was total and complete. At the Central Police Dispatch Center, the air was thick with tension as operators tried to make sense of the simultaneous emergencies. Reports of explosions, fires, and disabled vehicles flooded the lines, creating a digital fog of war that obscured the reality of the situation. The officers on the ground were dealing with a logistical nightmare, their resources spread thin, and their movements restricted by the sabotaged roads. They believed they were responding to a terrorist attack or a series of random, terrifying bombings, never once suspecting that the true target was much more specific and far more quiet. Back at the National Museum, the guards and the few remaining visitors were still blissfully unaware of the chaos unfolding just a few kilometers away. They could not hear the distant, muffled sirens or the shouts of the panicked crowds in the city center. To them, the museum was still a sanctuary, a place of peace, high art, and eternal beauty. But the clock was ticking down the final seconds, and the three men who had orchestrated this elaborate, violent symphony of destruction were moving into their final positions. They knew the police were trapped in a web of their own making. They knew the city was looking the other way. And they knew that the most daring and sophisticated art heist in Swedish history was about to begin within these very walls. The massive, ornate doors of the National Museum swung inward with a heavy, purposeful thud, cutting through the hushed air of the late afternoon. It was exactly 4:55, and the winter twilight had already swallowed the Stockholm skyline, leaving the city in a blue-tinted haze of falling snow and holiday lights. Inside the museum, the atmosphere was one of serene, cathedral-like stillness, a sharp contrast to the biting cold and the distant, muffled echoes of the chaos erupting across the city. The air in the lobby smelled of old stone, polished wood, and the faint, lingering scent of damp wool from the coats of the few remaining visitors. For a moment, the silence was absolute, a fragile bubble that seemed to hold the weight of centuries of art within its shimmering walls. Then, the rhythmic, heavy strike of combat boots against the checkerboard marble floor shattered the peace. Three men moved into the center of the foyer, their presence a jagged tear in the fabric of the gallery's dignity. They did not rush at first. They moved with the terrifying, practiced efficiency of a machine. One man, standing taller than the others, clutched a submachine gun against his chest, the black steel of the weapon absorbing the soft glow of the overhead chandeliers. He did not shout. He simply adjusted his grip, the sound of his gloves rubbing against the metal grip, a dry, raspy whisper that seemed to carry to every corner of the room. The lead gunman made a sharp, sweeping motion with his weapon, a silent command that was understood instantly. The few guards on duty, men who had spent their careers protecting beauty from the ravages of time, now found themselves facing the brutal reality of modern violence. There was no struggle. In the face of such overwhelming force, the world seemed to slow down, every breath becoming a conscious effort. The guards and the handful of straggling visitors were ordered to the floor. As they lowered themselves, the sensation of the cold, unyielding stone against their palms felt strangely grounding. One visitor later described the way the light from the tall windows caught the dust motes dancing in the air, a peaceful sight that felt entirely disconnected from the masked figures standing above them. The gunman in the lobby kept a watchful eye on the main entrance, his head turning slowly from side to side like a predatory bird. His breathing was steady. A low, mechanical sound filtered through the fabric of his mask. He was the anchor of the operation, the shadow that held the lobby in a state of frozen terror, while his two companions turned their focus toward the grand staircase that led to the upper galleries, where the true treasures of the Swedish crown were kept under soft, protective light. The other two men ascended the stairs with a predatory grace, their shadows stretching long and thin across the marble steps. They did not hesitate, navigating the corridors as if they had walked them 1,000 times in their dreams. They were heading for the second floor, a place where the history of Europe was told through oil and canvas. The air here felt thinner, cooler, and heavy, with the scent of aging varnish. Their first destination was a small, unassuming work that held a gravity far beyond its physical size. It was a self-portrait by the Dutch master Rembrandt, painted in the year 1630. As the men approached it, the painting seemed to glow from within, the master's eyes looking out from the copper plate with a piercing, timeless intensity. This was not a large canvas. It was a jewel, barely the size of a book, but it was worth tens of millions. One of the thieves reached out, his gloved fingers contrasting sharply with the gilded, scrolling edges of the frame. There was no reverence in his touch. He gripped the frame, and with a sharp, mechanical jerk, he pulled it from the wall. The sound of the security wire snapping was a high-pitched, metallic ping that echoed through the vaulted gallery like a dying note on a piano. The space where the painting had hung for so many years was suddenly a dark, empty void, a rectangular ghost on the wallpaper. Without speaking, the two men moved deeper into the shadows of the 17th century wing, their boots clicking softly against the parquet floors. They were seeking the light of the French Impressionists, a world of soft edges and vibrant color that felt almost sacrilegious to touch with such violence. They stopped before two works by Pierre-Auguste Renoir. The first, titled Young Parisian, painted in 1875, depicted a girl in a blue dress, her face a delicate wash of porcelain and rose, capturing a fleeting moment of youthful elegance. Beside it hung Conversation, from 1879, a masterclass in the play of light and shadow between a man and a woman lost in a private world. The thieves worked with a terrifying, surgical speed. They did not bother with the nuances of the art. They saw only the value. The Renoirs were lifted from their hooks, their heavy frames groaning as they were forced away from the plaster. The thieves moved with a practiced rhythm, one holding the weight while the other ensured the paintings were secured for transport. The texture of the canvas, the delicate brushwork that had survived over a century of gaze, was now pressed against the rough, industrial fabric of the thieves' gear. The transition was total. In less than a handful of minutes, 3 of the most significant pieces of art in the nation's history had been reduced to cargo, stripped of their sanctuary and thrust into the cold, dark world of the black market. As they made their way back down the stairs, the weight of the 3 masterpieces tucked under their arms, the lobby remained in its state of paralyzed silence. The lead gunman signaled his retreat, his eyes never leaving the prone figures on the floor. The sound of their footsteps retreating was faster now, a frantic, rhythmic drumming that signaled the end of the first act. They burst through the main doors once more, the sudden influx of the freezing December air swirling into the lobby like a ghost. Outside, the world was waiting. They did not head for the streets where the police were currently battling the gridlock and the burning car bombs. Instead, they turned toward the water. The museum sat on the edge of the harbor, a stone's throw from the dark, churning currents of the Baltic Sea. A high-speed motorboat was moored just outside, its engine humming a low, vibrating growl that mirrored the tension in the air. As the three men jumped into the craft, the paintings clattering against the deck, the driver opened the throttle. The boat surged forward, its wake a white, frothing scar on the black water, disappearing into the labyrinth of islands that make up the Stockholm archipelago. Back inside the museum, the dust began to settle. The guards slowly rose, their faces pale in the yellow light, staring up at the empty spaces on the walls where the shadows of the masterpieces still seemed to linger, a silent testament to a theft that had taken less time than a single breath of winter air. The heavy, ornate doors of the National Museum swung open with a muffled thud, and the freezing breath of a Stockholm December rushed in to meet them. The transition was jarring. The warmth of the gallery, thick with the scent of old wood and history, was instantly replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of the winter night. Under their arms, the three masterpieces felt unexpectedly heavy, their gilded frames biting into the fabric of the thieves' coats. There was no time for finesse now. The men moved with a practiced, frantic energy, their boots crunching against the frost-covered stone steps. Each breath they took came out as a thick, white plume of steam, swirling like ghosts in the dim glow of the streetlights. Behind them, the lobby remained frozen in a state of shock, the security guards still pressed against the cold marble floor, the silence of the museum shattered by the echoing retreat of footsteps. The city of Stockholm was beginning its evening descent into darkness, the sun having set hours ago, leaving the streets bathed in a pale, amber haze that did little to warm the biting air. They were no longer just men. They were vessels for 300 years of genius, carrying the weight of Rembrandt and Renoir through the biting northern wind. As they reached the pavement, the plan shifted into its most chaotic phase. One of the men reached into a heavy canvas sack, his gloved fingers brushing against the jagged, cold edges of dozens of steel caltrops. These small, four-pointed spikes, known in Sweden as footangels, were designed with a cruel geometric perfection. No matter how they landed, one point would always face upward, waiting to find the soft rubber of a tire. With a broad, sweeping motion, he scattered them across the asphalt, the metal stars clinking softly as they bounced and settled into the shadows. In the distance, the first low rumble of an explosion rolled across the city. One of the car bombs at the Grand Hotel had finally ignited. It was a calculated distraction, a violent roar designed to pull the attention of every emergency responder toward the pillars of smoke rising over the skyline. The air seemed to vibrate with the tension of it. The thieves knew that while the police were wrestling with the confusion of fire and wreckage, these tiny steel stars on the road would act as a silent, invisible barrier, turning any pursuing squad car into a crippled beast with shredded tires. The pavement was now a minefield, ensuring that the short distance between the museum and the water would remain their private corridor. They turned toward the quay, where the dark, oily water of the Nibroviken harbor lapped rhythmically against the stone embankment. The sound was hypnotic, a steady, wet slapping that masked the sound of their approach. Moored just beneath the edge of the pier was a small, sleek speedboat, its deep red hull nearly black in the low light. It sat low in the water, a predator waiting for the signal to strike. One by one, the men leaped from the stone edge into the boat, the fiberglass hull rocking gently under their weight. They laid the paintings down with a terrifying lack of ceremony, resting the priceless canvases on the damp floorboards of the vessel. The smell of diesel fuel and salt spray rose up to meet them, mixing with the sharp scent of the winter night. A fisherman, sitting in the distance on the opposite bank, watched the scene through the gloom, his eyes narrowing as he saw the silhouettes of three men jumping into a boat in such haste. He could not see the Rembrandt or the Renoirs. He only saw the suspicious rhythm of a getaway in progress. He noted the lines of the boat, the way it sat in the tide, and the frantic speed of the men as they prepared to cast off into the blackness of the archipelago. With a sudden, guttural roar, the boat's engine coughed to life, tearing through the silence of the waterfront like a jagged blade. The vibration hummed through the floorboards, traveling up the legs of the thieves and into the very frames of the stolen art. White foam churned at the stern as the propeller bit into the icy Baltic water, and within seconds, the museum began to recede. The grand, neoclassical facade of the National Museum, with its rows of windows and sturdy stone walls, grew smaller and smaller, turning into a pale shadow against the dark trees of the peninsula. The boat gathered speed, its bow lifting as it cut through the chop, sending a fine, freezing mist into the air. They were moving into the heart of the Stockholm waterways, a labyrinth of channels and islands where the darkness was their greatest ally. The wind whipped at their masks, the cold so intense it felt like needles against their exposed skin. Behind them, the wake of the speedboat created a widening white V on the surface of the harbor, a fleeting scar on the water that vanished as quickly as it appeared. They were ghosts on the tide, disappearing into the vast, ink-black throat of the Swedish night, leaving the sirens of the city to wail fruitlessly at the empty streets. Back within the walls of the museum, a profound and heavy vacuum had taken hold. In the gallery where the Rembrandt had hung for decades, there was now only a rectangular patch of wall that looked hauntingly naked. The dust motes, usually dancing in the soft light of the museum, seemed to settle in the sudden stillness. The wires that had once supported the weight of the Dutch master's self-portrait swung ever so slightly, a rhythmic metallic clicking that was the only sound in the room. It was a physical ache, a palpable sense of loss that radiated from the empty spaces. The three paintings, worth more than $42 million, were no longer there to anchor the room. The history they held, the brushstrokes of 1630 and the soft light of the 19th century, had been ripped out of their context and thrust into the cold, damp belly of a motorboat. The museum staff, slowly rising from the floor, stared at the walls with a look of pure, unadulterated disbelief. The air was still thick with the smell of the thieves' gunpowder and the lingering chill of the open doors, but the soul of the collection had been carried away into the wake of the boat, leaving behind nothing but the cold, indifferent stone of the building. The winter of 2001 descended upon Stockholm with a cruelty that felt personal. Outside the museum walls, the Baltic Sea turned a leaden gray, churning with ice that groaned against the stone embankments. Inside, the silence was even colder. The three empty spaces on the walls of the National Museum had become wounds that refused to heal. Each day, the staff walked past those ghostly rectangles of unfaded wallpaper, a constant reminder of the violence that had stripped the gallery of its crown jewels. The city was gripped by a strange, collective mourning. It was not just that the art was gone. It was the realization that the old world of Swedish security, a world built on trust and the quiet assumption of safety, had been shattered by the roar of a submachine gun and the smell of burning tires. The investigators, working out of a crowded office filled with the scent of stale coffee and the hum of fluorescent lights, felt the weight of a nation's expectations pressing down on them like the heavy, low-slung clouds of January. In the early weeks of the new year, the silence was broken by a whisper from the shadows. A ransom demand arrived, not through a direct call, but through the professional, sanitized voice of a lawyer. The price for the return of the Rembrandt and the two Renoirs was set at several $1 million. Along with the demand came photographs, grainy, stark images of the masterpieces resting against cheap, nondescript backgrounds. Seeing the paintings in such a state was like seeing a captured king in rags. The police, however, were not in the business of negotiating with shadows. They played a delicate, dangerous game of cat and mouse, tracing the letters, tracking the phone calls, and leaning on every informant they had in the Stockholm underworld. By late January, they struck. In a series of coordinated raids, they arrested 10 men, including the suspected masterminds, Alexander Petrov and Stefan Nordstrom. The lawyer who had acted as the middleman was also taken into custody. It felt like a triumph, a decisive blow against the gang that had humiliated the state. But as the cell doors slid shut, the investigators realized with a sinking heart that the victory was hollow. The men were in chains, but the canvases were still nowhere to be found. Months passed. The trial began in the spring, and the details of the heist became a fixture of the daily news. Yet the trail for the artwork had gone cold, buried under layers of criminal silence and the vast, dark networks of the international black market. Then, on a Tuesday in early April, the universe offered a small, unexpected mercy. In a grimy apartment building in central Stockholm, a group of narcotics officers prepared for a routine drug raid. They were not looking for masterpieces. They were looking for evidence of a local trafficking ring. The air in the narrow hallway smelled of damp concrete and old cooking oil. When they breached the door, they found the usual chaos of a criminal hideout, discarded bags, the clutter of a life lived on the run. But tucked away in a corner, hidden inside a plain, nondescript bag, was something that did not belong. As an officer pulled the object out, the dim light of the room caught the vibrant, delicate brushstrokes of a woman in a 19th-century gown. It was Renoir's Conversation. The painting, worth millions of dollars and centuries of history, had been sitting in the middle of a drug den, surrounded by the mundane grime of the underworld. It was unscathed, its colors still singing, a piece of heaven found in a very earthly hell. The recovery of Conversation on April 5, 2001, was a bittersweet moment for the Swedish authorities. They held a press conference, the flashes of cameras illuminating the small canvas as it was finally returned to the protective embrace of the museum's experts. But for every sigh of relief, there was a sharp pang of anxiety. 2 pieces remained missing, the young Parisian and the priceless Rembrandt self-portrait. The frustration among the detectives was palpable. They had the thieves, they had the convictions, and they had one painting back, but the heart of the collection was still beating somewhere in the dark. The investigation began to fray at the edges. Rumors suggested the remaining works had already been smuggled out of the country, perhaps to the Balkans, or deep into the vaults of a private collector who didn't care about the blood on the frame. The Swedish investigators were hampered by their own laws. At the time, the museum didn't even have security cameras, a fact that the lead detective, Gösta Andersson, lamented openly. The trail was no longer a path. It was a series of disconnected footprints in the sand, being washed away by the tide of time. As the sun began to linger longer over the Stockholm skyline in the summer of 2001, the case of the National Museum heist entered a long, agonizing period of dormancy. 7 of the 10 men were sentenced to years of prison, the heavy gates of the Swedish correctional system closing behind them. Yet they kept their secrets well. They knew that as long as the Rembrandt remained hidden, they held a sliver of leverage, a ghost of a chance for a future deal. The public's attention began to drift, drawn to other scandals and the rhythms of daily life. But for the curators at the museum, the loss remained a physical ache. They would look at the wall where the Rembrandt had once commanded the room, a self-portrait on copper that seemed to watch the world with a weary, knowing gaze. It was gone, lost to a world of speedboats and smoke grenades. The whispers in the underworld continued, stories of the painting being seen in Copenhagen or perhaps Los Angeles. But they were just that, whispers. The masterpieces were now part of the deep, silent currents of the global art underground, waiting for someone to find them, while the investigators could do nothing but wait and listen for a sound in the dark. By the late summer of 2005, The trail that had grown cold across the frozen Baltic waters began to pulse with a new, feverish heat. Far from the grand halls of Stockholm, the investigation had drifted south, settling into the damp, salt-kissed air of Copenhagen. The city was cloaked in the soft, gray light of September, a time when the days begin to surrender their warmth to the persistent chill of the North Sea. In the shadows of the Danish capital, a high-stakes game of shadows was reaching its crescendo. For nearly 5 years, the missing Rembrandt self-portrait had been a ghost, whispered about in the dim corners of the European underworld, but never seen. It was a masterpiece on a copper plate, no larger than a postcard, yet its weight in history was immeasurable. The hunt had transformed into an international spiderweb, drawing in the expertise of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's art crime team from across the Atlantic. They were not looking for common thieves anymore. They were hunting for the end of a long, dark road. The atmosphere in the city was heavy with anticipation, the kind of stillness that precedes a summer storm. Every brick in the cobblestone streets seemed to hold a secret, and every passing boat in the harbor felt like it might be carrying the treasure that had vanished in the spray of a speedboat 5 years prior. Inside a luxury hotel overlooking the Copenhagen waterfront, the air was unnervingly still. The room was a study in sterile elegance, filled with the faint, clinical scent of lavender floor wax and the low, rhythmic hum of a concealed air conditioning unit. In this room sat a man named Robert Whitman, a seasoned agent who had spent his life navigating the blurred lines between high society and the criminal fringe. Tonight, he was not a federal officer. He was a buyer, a representative for a shadowy syndicate with deep pockets and a hunger for the world's most dangerous art. He adjusted his cufflink, the small metal click sounding like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. On the table before him sat a heavy leather briefcase containing $250,000 in cash, the bait for a trap that had taken months to set. Every detail had to be perfect. In the adjacent room, separated only by a thin wall and a door that stood a fraction of an inch ajar, Danish police and Swedish investigators waited in total darkness. They were ghosts in the architecture, their breath held, their ears tuned to the low-frequency vibrations of the hallway. The carpet beneath Whitman's feet was thick and plush, swallowing the sound of his own restless shifting as he watched the digital clock on the bedside table bleed red numbers into the twilight. 5 minutes to the hour. Then came the sound. It was the muffled chime of the elevator at the end of the long, carpeted corridor. Then, the rhythmic, heavy thud of footsteps, not one pair, but several. Whitman felt the familiar, cold prickle of adrenaline at the base of his neck, but his face remained a mask of professional indifference. A sharp, insistent knock echoed against the heavy oak door. When he turned the brass handle, the air from the hallway rushed in, carrying the scent of rain and cheap tobacco. 4 men entered the room, their eyes darting like trapped birds, scanning the corners for any sign of a double cross. They were a diverse group, a mix of nationalities bound together by the desperation of a 5-year-old crime that had become a burden they could no longer carry. One of them held a simple, nondescript bag close to his chest, his knuckles white against the fabric. There was no greeting, only the heavy, electric tension of a business transaction where life and liberty hung by a thread. The curtains were drawn tight against the Copenhagen skyline, leaving only the soft glow of a single-floor lamp to illuminate the faces of men who had lived in the dark for far too long. They spoke in low, hushed tones, the sounds of their voices blending into a textured drone that filled the small space. With slow, deliberate movements, the man with the bag reached inside. The sound of rustling bubble wrap and paper was agonizingly loud, a crinkling symphony that seemed to stretch the very fabric of time. As the layers were peeled away, the golden light of the lamp caught a flash of metal. And there it was, the Rembrandt, the tiny self-portrait from 1630, painted on a small plate of copper, emerged from its plastic cocoon. It looked impossibly small, a pocket-sized window into the soul of a master who had been dead for centuries. Whitman leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he took in the familiar brushstrokes. He saw the artist's youthful face, the shadow of a cap, the subtle play of light across the eyes. It was a haunting gaze that had survived a high-speed boat chase, the damp cellars of the underworld, and the greed of desperate men. The painting was still in its original frame, the gilded wood slightly tarnished but intact. To the thieves, it was $100,000 in quick cash, a fraction of its true value of $35 million. To the world, it was the return of a lost piece of human history. Whitman reached out, his gloved fingers trembling almost imperceptibly as he took the weight of the copper into his hands. It was cold, heavy, and undeniably real. The air in the room seemed to thicken as the verification began. Whitman pulled a small magnifying loupe from his pocket, his breath hitching as he leaned into the frame. He was looking for the micro cracks in the paint, the specific way the oil had settled onto the copper surface nearly 4 centuries ago. He compared the image to high-resolution photographs burned into his memory. The 4 men watched him, their bodies coiled like springs, their eyes flickering toward the briefcase of cash and back to the door. Every second felt like an hour. Outside, the sounds of the city had faded away, leaving only the internal thrum of the hotel and the heavy, humid silence of the room. The agent knew that in the shadows of the floor above and the room next door, the Danish special forces were poised, their hands on the doorframes, waiting for the one word that would end the charade. He looked up from the painting, locking eyes with the leader of the group. He smiled, a slow, practiced expression of satisfaction. "It is beautiful," he whispered, the words hanging in the air like smoke. He reached for the money, but his other hand moved toward his pocket, a prearranged signal that the prize was secured and the trap was ready to spring. The transition from silence to chaos was instantaneous. As Whitman gave the final word, the door to the adjacent room didn't just open, it seemed to explode inward. The sterile peace of the hotel suite was shattered by the thunderous shouts of the Danish police as they swarmed the space. The 4 men were on the floor in seconds, the metallic ring of handcuffs echoing against the walls. In the center of the storm, Whitman stood perfectly still, cradling the small copper plate against his chest like a child. The 5-year exile of the Rembrandt was over. The painting that had been snatched from the walls of the National Museum in the final minutes of a winter evening in 2000 was finally safe. As the suspects were led away through the quiet hotel corridors, the adrenaline began to ebb, replaced by a profound, weary sense of relief. The gray Copenhagen morning was beginning to break through the edges of the curtains, casting a soft, pale light over the room. The hunt had ended not with a firefight on the high seas, but with a quiet exchange in a nondescript room, where the patient persistence of the law had finally outlasted the reckless greed of the thieves. The masterpiece was going home, its journey through the shadows finally at an end. The long silence that followed the initial chaos of December 2000 lasted much longer than anyone had anticipated. For months, the trail was as cold as the salt spray of the Baltic Sea. The Swedish authorities waited, their ears ringing with the phantom echoes of submachine gun fire and the roar of a getaway boat, while the walls of the National Museum remained hauntingly bare. Then, in the early spring of 2001, the first flicker of light appeared. It was April, a month of gray skies and thawing ice, when police in Stockholm executed what they believed was a routine drug raid. The air in the small apartment was heavy, with the sharp, chemical tang of illicit substances and the stale smell of neglect. But as the officers sifted through the debris of a life on the fringes, they found something that did not belong in the grime. Tucked away inside a simple bag was a canvas that breathed with the light of another century. It was Pierre-Auguste Renoir's Conversation. The delicate strokes of the French master, depicting a quiet moment in a rose garden, were miraculously intact. There were no bullet holes, no tears from the serrated edges of the heist. It was a bonus. A ghost of the museum returned from the shadows, though its two companions remained lost in the vast, dark network of the global underworld. 4 more years passed in a state of suspended animation. The paintings had become more than art. They were ghosts, whispers used as collateral in the high-stakes games of international syndicates. They moved through the hands of men who saw only dollar signs where there was actually the soul of history. It wasn't until the year 2005 that the mystery began to unspool in earnest, thousands of miles away from the cobblestones of Stockholm. In the sprawling, sun-drenched labyrinth of Los Angeles, an investigation into a Bulgarian crime ring led federal agents to a most unexpected discovery. There, amidst the neon and the heat, was the young Parisian. When the agents looked upon the face of the young woman in the painting, they saw a tiny, superficial scratch near her ear, a small scar from her journey through the darkness. The varnish was slightly dulled, perhaps from the humidity of shipping containers or the dry air of hidden basements, but her spirit remained. The recovery of the second Renoir sent a surge of electricity through the art world. It provided the final, vital link to the most elusive prize of all. The small, shimmering self-portrait of Rembrandt van Rijn, painted on a tiny plate of copper so many centuries ago. The endgame played out in a hotel room in Copenhagen in September of 2005. The atmosphere was thick with a calculated, professional tension. Robert Whitman, an undercover agent with a deep appreciation for the weight of history, sat in a room at the Scandic Hotel, waiting. Outside, the Danish winds whipped through the streets, but inside, the air was still and expectant. When the sellers finally arrived, they carried a package wrapped with the care of a precious secret. As the layers of brown paper were peeled back, the golden light of the hotel lamps hit the copper. There he was, Rembrandt himself, looking back from across the ages with a steady, knowing gaze. The painting was no larger than a postcard, yet it held a gravity that anchored the entire room. The men were asking for $500,000, a mere fraction of its $37 million value, desperate to offload a treasure that had become too heavy for them to carry. As the signal was given and the authorities closed in, the 5-year odyssey of the Stockholm masterpieces finally reached its crescendo. The copper plate was cool to the touch, and for the first time since that winter afternoon in 2000, the 3 sisters were destined to be reunited. In the courtrooms of Sweden, the reckoning was final. The men who had orchestrated the smoke and the fire, including the masterminds Alexander Petrov and Stefan Nordstrom, stood before the bench to answer for their ambition. The sentences were heavy, ranging from 3 to more than 6.5 years of incarceration. They were ordered to pay damages exceeding 35 million krona, a financial weight that would shadow them long after their release. But the true resolution was found not in the gavel's fall, but in the quiet corridors of the National Museum. On September 22, 2005, just hours before a major exhibition of the Dutch Golden Age was set to open, the Rembrandt was returned to its rightful place. The curators worked in a focused silence, their gloved hands trembling slightly as they secured the frame to the wall. The museum's security had been transformed. The once vulnerable galleries were now protected by layers of invisible technology and steel, a testament to the hard lessons learned in the wake of the speedboat's wake. The 3 paintings were home, their colors vibrant once more under the soft, controlled museum lights. As we look back on this journey, we see the fragility of our shared heritage. A few minutes of violence can scatter centuries of beauty to the corners of the earth, yet the persistence of those who protect it can bring it back from the brink. The heist of the National Museum remains a singular moment in the history of crime, a story of car bombs and speedboats that eventually surrendered to the patient work of law and art. Today, if you walk through those quiet halls in Stockholm, you can see them. You can stand before the Rembrandt and feel the depth of his gaze, or lose yourself in the gentle, impressionist light of the Renoirs. They carry the stories of their theft, but they are no longer defined by it. They are survivors. The museum is quiet now. The water of the harbor is still, reflecting the city lights like a mirror. The shadows that once held these masterpieces have retreated, and the air is filled only with the soft hum of the gallery's breath. The past has been reconciled, and the paintings are safe in their frames, watching over the city as the world outside drifts into its own quiet rhythm. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.